Western political media class has been dismissing as conspiracy theories all claims that the US is likely responsible for last month's sabotage of the Nord Stream gas pipelines, even while levelling the exact same accusations against Russia without ever using that term, which probably says a lot about the way that label has been used over the years, if you think about it. At a UN Security Council meeting on Friday, US envoy Richard Mills repeatedly accused Russia of promoting conspiracy theories in its Nord Stream accusations against the United States, saying that our Russian colleagues have decided to instrumentalize the Security Council meeting to spread conspiracy theories and disinformation. It's important that we use this meeting not to foster conspiracy theories, but to focus our attention on Russia's blatant violation of the Charter and its crimes in Ukraine, Mills argues, after saying that the United States categorically denies any involvement in this incident and that there is no justification for the Russian delegation raising conspiracy theories and mass disinformation in this council. Mills then spends the remainder of his remarks insinuating that it is actually Russia who perpetrated the attacks, mentioning the word infrastructure no less than 9 times in his arguments to establish that in Ukraine, Russia has a history of attacking critical civilian infrastructure similar to the pipelines. Here we have Jeffrey Sachs describing his evaluation of the incident.
My guess is, just like I think Ukraine is shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, I think the United States blew up Nord Stream. And they told us. Biden said it in February, said if Putin invades, Nord Stream is over. And then a reporter said, well, what do you mean, Mr. President? How are you going to do that? He said, we have our ways. We have our ways.
We will bring an end to it.
But how will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Come on. Who controls the airspace, who monitors the airspace, who has the means to do this, who said we're going to do it, who said afterwards, this is a tremendous opportunity, this new situation, a tremendous opportunity to permanently wean Europe from Russian gas. That would be Secretary of State Blinken. Who said, thank you, USA, tweeting a picture of the burst pipeline? That would be Radek Sikorski, former foreign minister of Poland. By the way, I've been in touch with reporters in papers that say we don't know, or even worse, who say Russia did this. And then I talk to very senior reporters, and they say, Jeff, of course it's the U.S. What do you think? But it doesn't get into our news. My guess is that we're going to hear from Europe's investigators in a week or so. Very hard. We don't know. Trail went cold. Very hard to tell. We'll keep looking, but we don't know. But terrible blow, terrible blow. That would be consistent with the U.S. doing it. And the fact that things went a bit quiet after this, rather than parliamentarians throughout Europe demanding our core infrastructure was blown up, tells me that they're told, keep it quiet, keep it quiet. We don't really want to know exactly what happened. So I can't prove this, but it sure does, to my mind, put all the suspicion on the US side. Warnings, motive, capability, subsequent behavior, strange statements. To my mind, it adds up. I don't think Russia would blow up its core infrastructure. That doesn't make sense. And anyone else that did it would, with Poland or Denmark or anyone else, that would be NATO, that would be with the US.
Business Insider has an article in which Russia experts warn that the sabotage of gas pipelines were a warning shot from Putin to the West and should brace for more subterfuge. The experts in question are as follows. Former CIA Director John Brennan, who was caught spying on U.S. lawmakers and lying about it during the Senate's investigation into CIA torture practices, U.S. intelligence veteran Andrea Kendall-Taylor, now a senior fellow at the warmongering think tank Center for a New American Security, whose top donors are the Pentagon and the arms manufacturer Northrop Grumman. Cynthia Hooper, a history professor at the College of the Holy Cross. That's it. That's all the experts. 2 9 warmongers and a history professor. Nowhere in the Business Insider article do the words conspiracy or theory appear. Contrast this with the recent Associated Press article titled "Russians Push Baseless Theory Blaming U.S. for Burst Pipeline," which was so frantic to spin accusations of U.S. Nord Stream sabotage as a crazy conspiracy theory that it framed it as something only QAnon cultists believe. Associated Press wrote that the suggestion that the U.S. caused the damage was circulating on online forums popular with American conservatives and followers of QAnon, a conspiracy theory movement which asserts that Trump is fighting a battle against a satanic child trafficking sect that controls world events. Over and over again we see the pejorative conspiracy theory applied to accusations against one nation, but not the other, despite the fact that it's the exact same accusation. They're both conspiracy theories per definition. The theories about an alleged conspiracy to sabotage Russian pipelines. But the Western political or media class consistently applies that label to one and never the other. Here's a link to another Business Insider article applying the conspiracy theory label to accusations of U.S. Nord Stream sabotage. Here's one from The Independent doing the same. Here's one from The Washington Post. Here's one from Newsweek. Here's one from Vox. Here's one from the Atlantic Council think tank. Here's one from the Brookings Institution think tank. Here's one from Media Matters for America, founded by the Center for American Progress think tank. Do you get the message? Are you receiving the messaging loud and clear? Accuse the U.S. of sabotaging the Nord Stream pipelines, and it's called a conspiracy theory. Accuse Russia of doing the exact same thing, and it's called news. And of course, by pointing out this cartoonish double standard, I do not mean to suggest that both theories are equally well evidenced. One wouldn't expect them to be in a contest in which one party had their own energy infrastructure sabotaged. For example, there's the fact that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken explicitly said that the sabotage of pipelines delivering Russian gas to Germany offers a tremendous opportunity to end Europe's dependency on Russian energy.
Ultimately, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity to, once and for all, remove the dependence on Russian energy, and thus to take away from Vladimir Putin the weaponization of energy as a means of advancing his imperial designs. That's very significant, and that offers tremendous strategic opportunity for the years to come. But meanwhile, we're determined to do everything we possibly can to make sure that the consequences of all of this are not borne by citizens in our countries, or for that matter, around the world.
There's also the fact that a 2019 Pentagon Commission study by the Rand Corporation on how to overextend and weaken Russia explicitly stated that the U.S. would benefit from stopping Nord Stream 2. There's also the fact that both President Joe Biden and his Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland explicitly said that Nord Stream 2 would be brought to an end if Russia invades Ukraine.
With regard to Nord Stream 2, we continue to have very strong and clear conversations with our German allies, and I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
The U.S. sanctioned those who built Nord Stream 2. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice is on record saying the U.S. wants Europeans to be more dependent on North American energy than on pipelines from Russia.
And I also understand that one of the complications is the Europeans, who are very dependent on the Russians for energy supply and business relationships, but they also need to recognize that if Putin is not stopped now, we could find ourselves in a real conflict with Russia down the road.
Well, actually, let me jump in right there. Germany, arguably the strongest power in Europe, at least economically. Right. There's been criticism that Angela Merkel and others haven't been aggressive enough. What do you think of that? Do you think Germany's been as aggressive as they should be? I'm quite an admirer of Chancellor Merkel, and I heard her statement when she was with President Obama in Washington. I thought it was a very good statement. But now we need to have tougher sanctions, and I'm afraid at some point this is going to probably have to involve oil and gas. The Russian economy is vulnerable. 80% of Russian exports are in oil, gas, and minerals. People say, well, the Europeans will run out of energy. Well, the Russians will run out of cash before the Europeans run out of energy. And I understand that it's uncomfortable to have an effect on business ties in this way. But this is one of the few instruments that we have. Over the long run, you simply want to change the structure of energy dependence. You want to depend more on the North American energy platform, the tremendous bounty of oil and gas that we're finding in North America. You want to have pipelines that don't go through Ukraine and Russia. For years, we've tried to get the Europeans to be interested in different pipeline routes. It's time to do that. And so some of this is simply acting, and acting as quickly as possible.
Germans had just been angrily demanding an end US-led sanctions on Russia and a reopening of Nord Stream gas. US naval forces were recently conducting unmanned underwater vehicle drills right where the pipelines are attacked. Unmanned underwater vehicles have been found carrying explosive charges near Russian pipelines in the past. Poland literally just inaugurated a gas pipeline that will transport gas from Norway through Denmark and Baltic Sea. US military helicopters were reportedly recorded travelling between the blast points and along the Nord Stream 2 pipeline shortly before the explosions. The CIA has a known history of blowing up Russian gas pipelines. Els says that sabotage of critical infrastructure should be of concern to us all. In the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we have seen numerous Russian attacks damaging civilian infrastructure. We witnessed Russia recklessly seize control of Europe's largest nuclear power plant, risking a nuclear disaster in Europe. We saw countless attacks destroying civilian electricity infrastructure. Mills concludes that despite efforts that we heard today to distract us from the truth, to distribute more disinformation and slightly wacky theories, the facts on the ground in Ukraine speak for themselves. Here Senator Ron Johnson, in December 2021, is simply asking for the sabotage of the pipeline.
I'm literally talking about rolling back the pipeline. And you can loosely define that, but I mean taking action that will prevent it from ever becoming operational.
Here we have Jeffrey Sachs addressing the attacks on the nuclear power plant.
Russia is in control right now of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It is being shelled. We hear that's very dangerous, which it is. You shouldn't shell nuclear power plants. Now, one side controls the plant. So who is actually shelling the plant? Well, our media say, oh, we don't know who's shelling the plant. And they can't put one and one together to say, well, if Russia's in control of the plant, maybe they're not shelling their own plant. Maybe it's Ukraine shelling the plant. Well, I can tell you, I speak to a lot of people. It's almost surely Ukraine shelling the power plant. And we can't bring ourselves to express a simple truth. And that hurts because they continue to shell the power plant with impunity. And we should say, stop shelling the power plant. Yes, it would be good if you had control of the power plant, we could say to them, but don't shell a nuclear power plant. But we can't even find those words. That's the problem. because we're kind of faking the whole thing as if this isn't a US-Russia thing. Then we say, okay, do it, go, defeat Putin. That's great, that's what we want. Defeat the guy with 1,600 active nuclear warheads and several thousand more in reserve. Go ahead, go do it. As if this isn't our Armageddon that we're heading to. And that's really been a massive failure of this administration till now. One thing I've learned I'm 67 years old. I've been through a lot of US wars, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and more. It's the job of the President of the United States to put on the brakes, because this country is a war machine at the top. We don't see it. We don't know it exactly. Eisenhower told us about it with the military-industrial complex. This country is a war machine. The main job of the President of the United States is to stop the war machine from making wars. And we are now in an escalation heading towards Armageddon, according to the president. That's not a spectator sport. That's his job, to keep us away from Armageddon.
The US agenda isn't to de-escalate, but make it worse, as Ukraine blasts the Crimean Bridge, which was the only connection between Mother Russia and the peninsula. Here you see how the CNN analyst applauded Ukrainian for such a terrorist act, which blatantly shows how the US supports it.
So Ukrainians are already cheering the Crimean Bridge explosion, even without claiming a responsibility. One senior Ukrainian official posting this on Twitter: Marilyn Monroe's famous birthday serenade to JFK.
Happy birthday to you.
And this is why the explosion of the Kerch Bridge coming just hours after Vladimir Putin's 70th birthday. In Kyiv, Ukrainians took selfies in front of a painting of the bridge blast. For more, let's turn to CNN military analyst, retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Layton. Colonel, so good to see you. So Fred Pleitgen used the word humiliating, that this would be humiliating to Putin. How do you see it?
Oh, definitely, Frederica. This is one of the biggest humiliations that Putin could experience, let alone, if something happened in Moscow. But in this situation with the Kerch Bridge being blown up, what you're seeing is a major engineering project of the Russian Federation being disrupted and at least part of it destroyed. So this is a big blow to the prestige of Russia, and especially to Putin's personal prestige.
In a bizarre way to mark a terrorist act which killed 3 civilians, Kiev residents take selfies with a giant stand displaying the Crimean Bridge bust. So, what would be Russia's response? Thermal power plant in West Ukraine reportedly neutralized by Russian missile strike. According to local media, there is no longer hot water in the city of Lvov, west of Kiev, following the strike. The warehouse of the Ukrainian cosmetics brand that celebrated the Crimean Bridge terror attack got destroyed. 90% of western Ukraine city without power. According to local media, Lvov's trams and trolley buses are unable to run, and over 80% of the city's traffic lights do not work. There's also no hot water following Russian strikes targeting major Ukrainian infrastructure. Right after this, Putin warned Ukraine and addressed Russia's Security Council.
Kiev regime has placed itself alongside international terrorist organizations, the most notorious ones. And it is impossible to leave these crimes without a due response. This morning, on the initiative of the Ministry of Defense, and according to the plan, strikes using high-precision weapons from land, sea, and air carriers were made against objects in the Ukrainian territory. We will make a serious steps to provide an adequate response commensurate with the level of threats created to the Russian Federation. Nobody should have any doubts as to that.
Why does the US want to continue this war? Russia and Ukraine gave a try to come to accordance to prevent this war. But as Jeffrey Sachs describes, the US and UK did not let it be accomplished.
So far, where the United States is saying, we will continue to do whatever it takes to defeat Russia. Well, when you have superpowers talking in that way, you better damn take it as a big threat. And I have not appreciated the US policies in this all along, because I think I'm actually a little relieved in a weird way that Biden said this, because I felt this all along. I felt that the US policy was on a path of escalation and that they didn't have an off-ramp in their minds. By the way, there's an obvious off-ramp, and this is the whole point of this war, if you really know something about it from the beginning. And the off-ramp is that NATO says we're not going to enlarge to Ukraine, period. That was the off-ramp that would have prevented the war. That was the off-ramp that would have stopped this war in March, when Russia and Ukraine, under the mediation of Turkey, exchanged documents and said publicly, as well as the Turkish mediators, we're close to an agreement. Many of us think that the US rushed in and said, oh, no, don't do that. You know, we don't know ever with our government what's really going on, because they don't tell the truth. That just goes with the business of government, the way that it's viewed in Washington. But my feeling is that there are a lot of signs that the US has been against a negotiated end to this war, because my interpretation is that this issue of NATO enlargement is a deeply held objective of the United States going back to the early 1990s. It's as deeply rejected by Russia since that time. I've watched it on both sides. That's why we have a collision course that continues to escalate, and why we should take damn seriously this nuclear threat. But why Biden should ask himself, okay, well, good, he's asking what's the off-ramp? I'll give him the suggestion. We should never have suggested NATO enlargement to Ukraine. And we should stop now, because Putin was very clear at the end of 2021. Here are my red lines. And the core of them, the core of the red lines was neutrality of Ukraine. And I called the White House then. I said, that's good. That's actually right. That's not just a concession. That is right for all sides. The White House said, yeah, we don't like that. We believe Ukraine has the right to join NATO. I said, it's not a right, because it impinges directly on Russia's core security perceptions. You better talk. No, we're not talking about that. Well, they better talk. That's my bottom line. They really had better talk about this issue. By the way, you can't have Zelensky negotiating with Putin. This is a war between the US and Russia. And we need to have the President of the United States and the President of Russia talking with each other and avoiding Armageddon. That's, I think, the bottom line.
Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said the post-March negotiation process based on principles proposed by Ukraine and agreed upon by Moscow was sabotaged by Washington and London. The negotiations were abandoned by direct order of the US and London, Lavrov said on Russian television. The Istanbul phase of the negotiations was launched at Ukraine's request. The initiators of that process, abided by a transoceanic core, abandoned it. Lavrov also addressed recent speculation that Russia may use nuclear weapons. The top diplomat said that according to Russian nuclear doctrine, a strike may only occur in response to an attack which endangers the entire existence of the Russian Federation. Today we had Stoltenberg saying if Russia wins, it is not only a defeat for Ukraine, but for NATO as well. How did we get into the hands of these lunatics such as Stoltenberg and Biden?
Because it is important for all of us that Ukraine wins the battle, the war against the invading Russian forces. Because if Putin wins, that is not only a big defeat for the Ukrainians, but it will be defeat and dangerous for all of us, because it will make the world more dangerous, and it will make us more vulnerable for further Russian aggression. So that's the reason why
On the other hand, we have academics like John Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, and Noam Chomsky who believe the only way out of this conflict is the negotiation and nothing else.
What the U.S. can do is stop acting to prevent negotiations. For a long time, there's no time to review the record, but the position of the United States has been to try to undermine possibilities of negotiations. They're not alone in this. So if you take a look at the Macron-Putin discussions up to a few days before the invasion, President Macron was indeed trying very hard to avoid the invasion by offering various options for a peaceful settlement. Putin, we have the actual transcript of this, no guesswork. Putin was dismissive at the very end, a couple of days before the invasion. He just dismissed it with contempt, said, sorry, I've got to go ice skating, something like that. So the U.S. is not alone, but its role has been to act to make negotiations harder to achieve, unlikely. That's as recently as late April, as far as we know. Well, one thing the United States can do is stop acting like that. Drop the position, the official position, that the war must go on to weaken Russia severely, meaning no negotiations. Would that open the way to negotiations? Diplomacy? Can't be sure. There's only one way to find out. That's to try. If you don't try, of course it won't happen.
So, why is Ukraine so important to the US? In a way that Lindsey Graham says the US wants to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian.
4 months into this thing, I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person.
Jeffrey Sachs explains why Ukraine is so important to the US.
I think that the core motivation of the US goes back to the neocon approach to foreign policy, which basically has been the approach of the United States for 30 years now. At the end of the Soviet Union, the neocons took power. They're still in power. And their view is the US is the unipolar power. It's the sole superpower, and we're going to keep it that way. And under US strategic doctrines right now, there are two threats. Russia is one and China is the other. And it's not an accident that we're in confrontations on two fronts right now. So when it comes to Russia, Zbig Brzezinski pretty much spelled this out in his very interesting book, The Global Chessboard, Grand Chessboard, A Global Chessboard, 1997, where he said that Ukraine is the geographical pivot of Eurasia. It's the key. If the United States is basically in charge, Russia ceases to be even a regional power, basically. It's cut out from the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Ukraine's a big prize if you're a neocon. And a neocon is someone who views the world like the game of Risk, that you want to get all your pieces on the board and you want to take all of your opponent's pieces off the board. And Ukraine is really strategic from their point of view. And this has been spelled out by Robert Kagan, for example. They've written about this quite openly. And of course, that family has been part of this for the whole time, because Victoria Nuland is the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the United States right now. She's been through this, through all these administrations. And so I think that this is the core, that we're going to expand NATO. They have the idea that the North Atlantic reaches to Georgia. Now, that's an interesting idea. That was George Bush's geographical insight in 2008. Extraordinarily cynical, but if you look at a map, what's the game plan? The game plan is control the Black Sea. It is Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all surrounding Russia, where their naval fleet is. So that's what Brzezinski was outlining back in 1997. Now, they thought they could kind of slip it in without Russia being able to oppose it, because they kept expanding NATO step by step. First, the three, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, by the way, against the promise, the clear, unequivocal promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand to the east. And like so many other things, the US government said, oh, we never said that. Well, they're liars. Of course they said it. And there's a full documentary record, easily accessible on the web, to understand what was said. So long and the short of it is, that's been the game plan for 30 years. And it's had its ups and downs, because Ukraine itself is internally divided between East and West. And so the presidents have gone back and forth, pro-Russia, anti-Russia. And when a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, came in 2010, after Bush had invited Ukraine into NATO, over the opposition, by the way, of European leaders, but this is a US-led alliance, Yanukovych guided neutrality through the Ukrainian parliament. That stabilized things for a little while, until Yanukovych was overthrown. Overthrown by whom? Well, according to the US narrative, the masses on the streets. According to what I saw with my own eyes, we stirred a lot of the pot and paid for a lot of that overthrow. I don't know how much. Everything's a lie. Everything's hidden. But the Russians say that was a coup that the US led. I can't tell you exactly the US role, but we heard Victoria Nuland on the tape describing the formation of the new government, and other choice words for our European allies. And I know with my own eyes, by the way, about US involvement in that. Not my involvement. I saw it. I was, oh my God, that's pretty weird what's going down. And this is Russia's point, which is, okay, you broke it again. Now, because as soon as Yanukovych went down, the new government said, we want NATO. And then the US started pouring in the weapons, billions of dollars during the Trump years. Then Biden came in, I thought, my God, maybe we'll get some sanity. Of course, he doubled down 3 times in 2021. At the highest levels, we said, Ukraine will be a member of NATO. In the NATO annual meeting, in a State Department strategic document with Ukraine, and in a Defense Department strategic document. So we doubled down. That's when I called the White House at the end of the year, please take the off-ramp. But they don't want to take the off-ramp. Now we're close to Armageddon, we're told. There is an off-ramp. We better take the off-ramp. We better start talking rather than just escalating.
So, why the US wants to keep fighting? Are they really thinking that they are going to win this war? Here we have the evaluations of Colonel Douglas Macgregor on the Ukraine war so far.
But what we've seen now for the last 2 months in southern Ukraine on the Russian side is effectively what I would call an economy of force mission. Most of the regular army, in fact, all the regular army combat troops, and there were never more than 80,000 of them in Ukraine to begin with, have been largely withdrawn. And they have been replaced by a little over 50,000 troops who are very good fighters, by the way, but we would call them either volunteers or mercenaries or National Guard types, reserve formations, principally the Chechens commanded by Kadyrov, and you have some Kuban Cossack organizations. You have the Wagner mercenary groups, if you will. The Wagner fighters and the Chechens are absolutely first rate. Their mission is very simple. We're putting you on the periphery in a defense of southern Ukraine, the areas that we now occupy as Russians, that we've now annexed. We want you to defend them, but you're under no obligation to defend to the last man or to defend every inch of terrain. You are free to withdraw whenever necessary in order to find more defensible terrain, because your real mission is to drag in as many Ukrainian forces as you can and destroy them, principally with artillery, air power, and long-range strike weapons. And that's what's been going on. And the kill ratio has been, up until now, for every one Russian soldier or Russian volunteer, Chechen, whatever, in southern Ukraine that's wounded or killed, and there are very few being killed, 5 to 6 Ukrainians are killed or wounded. And that ratio seems to be improving in favor of the Russian side every day. But what we have is an attempt by the Ukrainians. They're throwing virtually everything they have, including the kitchen sink, into this. Almost 300,000 people, of whom maybe 30,000 are really very well trained. And they're concentrating 40 or 50,000 whenever they can in a relatively narrow zone against perhaps 3, 4, 5,000 Russian troops. And in some cases, they're succeeding in pushing them back, but in the process, they're losing 40 to 50% of the attacking force, and they can't replace the equipment. And what happens is that they move perhaps 20 miles, 15 miles to more defensible terrain. And we got to understand, in this part of the world, everything's very open and rolling. So if you can fall back to a slightly higher elevation with an open field of fire, in other words, you're not looking at forest or looking at a village or a town, you have the ability to destroy large numbers of attacking Ukrainian forces in relatively short order. And that's really what's happening. So these great claims of, we're raising the flag and whatever it is, we've gotten it all back, we're heroes and we're winning. That looks good on television. It's a great propaganda ploy, but in reality, it's not gaining anything strategically, and it's playing into the Russian hands. Someone pointed out to me, and then I subsequently listened to it on Fox, I think it was Lieutenant General retired Kellogg, who is part of former President Trump's inner circle, was telling everyone on Fox that the Russians were running out of tanks. Now they have to fall back on T-62s. Well, this morning, long columns of brand new T-80 tanks from the Russian army were seen moving into the northeastern section of Ukraine, crossing bridges, moving in very rapidly. And we've already seen T-80s begin to show up down in southern Ukraine. So I don't know what the source of information is. Leon Panetta was on saying similar things. And then, of course, there's always the claim Putin can't survive this. Putin's back is against the wall. He's not going to be with us much longer. Of course, they also said that about Assad in Syria. And in this case, it's particularly absurd because from inside Russia, the picture is very, very different. He's not only popular, and he really is popular in the high 80s right now, he's probably been stronger than ever. The only anger directed at President Putin is the feeling among Russians that he's taken too long to attack decisively. They haven't understood his rationale for the way things have been going for the last several months. And their attitude is, sure, this is a brother Slavic country. We understand that. But these people deserve the worst. Look what they've done to us, and so forth and so on. So the population is actually far more aggressive, if you will, in its attitudes and readiness to fight than, frankly, the president has been. But I think that is changing now, because this economy of force mission will probably continue until the ground freezes. And the forces being assembled in Belarusia and in Western Russia are enormous. And they include a lot of armaments that we haven't seen before, vast numbers of Iskander missile launchers and Iskander missiles. And that, when that lands and it has a precision guided warhead of over 1,000 pounds TNT equivalent, it registers on the Richter scale. So these things are being massed. The Air Force is being massed. And he recently this morning gave instructions, according to British intelligence, that they were to disable or destroy satellites over Ukraine. He wouldn't tolerate any more satellites working for the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, hopefully, that doesn't include American satellites, but It's not a secret that if they're up there and they are immediately over Ukraine inside the Ukrainian battle space, they could be shot down. I think it's very clear that when President Putin began this campaign, he fully expected that when he demonstrated that he was serious about eliminating the threat to Russia in eastern Ukraine, something which he had been talking about for a long time. This was over the last 8 years, was made very clear. He also expected that he would have a negotiating partner. He thought that not only would the Ukrainians want to negotiate, but he thought, I think, that Washington would be interested in negotiating an end to the fighting and the conflict. I don't think he appreciated the level of ideological commitment and hatred in support of a war with Russia, and our willingness to turn this proxy war into our war in all but name, using Ukrainian lives instead of American and NATO lives per se. So it took him a while to come to terms with that, and I think he eventually did, especially when Mr. Biden went over in April and made his speech about regime change and talked about other things. I think at that point they figured this is a waste of time. These people aren't interested in negotiating an end to the conflict. At that point, they took stock and they said, okay, we're going to strike back, but we're not going to strike back in piecemeal fashion. We're not going to launch a series of offensives to drive back the Ukrainians. What we're going to do is take what we had originally thought was Russian anyway, which of course is, the people that live there are Russians in those areas. Then we are going to build up for a major offensive. If they will not cooperate, if they will not recognize the legitimacy of our position, then we will launch it and we will terminate this conflict on our terms. Well, you got to keep in mind that this is a theater that's almost 800 miles deep and certainly 500-600 miles wide. It's a vast area that requires a lot of time to position forces, move forces. This applies to Ukrainians, it applies to the Russians. And now I think what we are on the verge of seeing is this major offensive. He may actually approach the Ukrainians one more time. And then if he has no success and no one will talk, I think he's going to unloose hell, frankly. And we're going to see a very different Russian military establishment doing things that, frankly, people like me and others thought they would do much earlier. But again, the man did not want to kill civilians, contrary to what is said in the West. He didn't want to damage lots of infrastructure. His view was, we want to live with Ukrainians when this is over. So we want minimal damage. We want early talks and negotiations. It all failed. No longer matters. If there's no final willingness to talk, then I think we will see what I and others thought would happen early on, a massive, uninterrupted, devastating assault throughout the country. There is no evidence of the Russians preparing to use nuclear weapons whatsoever. No nuclear warheads in sight, nothing being moved forward, out of the question. Putin has repeatedly said, even though the West does not bother listening to the man, and that's one of our problems, that nuclear weapons are exclusively for retaliatory purposes. In other words, if we are struck with a nuclear weapon, we will retaliate. So the notion that he has any plans for that is ridiculous. Secondly, if he's ever used more than 20% of his ground force, and we haven't even looked at the Air Force and the rocket forces and everything else he has at his disposal, what makes anyone think that he would feel the need to use a nuclear weapon? I don't think he does. Today, the conventional armaments at his disposal, these warheads on these missiles and rockets, are so devastating and so precise, there's no longer a requirement for a nuclear warhead. Remember that originally nuclear warheads were developed by the Russians and ultimately by us because we wanted to be sure to destroy the enemy, and we did not have precision. So you needed a large blast area to be sure that you would actually hit something that mattered. That's been passé for years, and the Russians have said so in their doctrine. So the age of precision-guided munitions and space-based intelligence and instantaneous communications is with us. So that sort of thing is not needed. Now, what are we going to do? Well, we have people in Washington with loose tongues and, making dumb comments about limited nuclear war. I'm shocked when I hear it. I can't believe it. It's insane. And one of the things that I opposed, but I couldn't do anything about it, was that during the last year of the Trump administration, he signed a defense bill that authorized people to build so-called tactical nuclear weapons. And I know that President Trump was not comfortable with it, but he wasn't prepared to veto the whole bill. That's usually how these kinds of things are packaged. Make it impossible to veto the bill, because if you do, you're going to hurt all sorts of other programs and nobody wants to hurt them. I think it was a mistake. I think he should have. And one thing the Democrats have gotten right, I'm talking about the Democrats on the Hill and the House and the Senate, who've been sadly very silent on this matter, is there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. I mean, the whole thing is just crazy. We'll launch a low-yield nuclear warhead of less than 5 kilotons. Don't worry, the other side will understand. Well, that's absurd. A nuclear detonation goes off in your backyard. You trigger something in eastern Ukraine where there's a Russian concentration with a tactical nuclear weapon. And what do they think in Moscow? Oh, my God, we better launch a first strike or we'll lose our arsenal. And what have you got? Armageddon. It's insane. It needs to stop. And, no one is exercising, in my judgment, proper restraint in this regard. Someone in the White House should say, forget it. It's not on the table, out of the question. We haven't heard that, though. And I know that if Trump were there, that's something he would definitely say. There are people who think that they can bully Russia. I mean, this whole thing began because people were confident for the last 20 years that Russia was weak and Russia could be bullied into whatever we wanted them to do. And once we had established all these globalist ideologues who are in league with the neocons, who have been trying to use American military power for 30 years to effectively dominate the world, and you have the globalists who also want to make our financial system a permanent feature of life for everyone on the planet by bullying them with the financial system. You put those things together, and I think their attitude is, well, he needs to understand that we're ready to use it. But anybody who knows anything about the Russians knows that that's a very bad idea. The Russians aren't going to be bullied. It'll have the exact opposite effect. This war, for which nobody voted. I mean, when's the last time somebody asked the United States, let's have a plebiscite? How many people here think we should, potentially go to war in Eastern Europe against the Russians on behalf of Ukraine? No one's being asked. Same things happen in Europe, and the Germans are saying, wait a minute, we didn't sign up for this. And that's why I think NATO and the EU, for example, these institutions are in very great danger of fragmenting and falling apart. And of course, remember, the globalists said those were the institutions that we were, quote unquote, defending. What should we do? We need to step back and understand larger strategic interests, at least interests that may or may not be real for the American people, but are being driven in Washington by interests. The largest, most powerful scientific industrial state in terms of output, production, growth, all of those matters by any measure in Europe and in much of the world, frankly, certainly it's in the top 3 or 4, is Germany. Historically, there has been peace in Europe and cooperation whenever Moscow and Berlin have cooperated. And that goes back over 300 years. And I think the Anglo-Saxon powers, Great Britain, primarily the British Empire, and then the United States, and now both Washington and London, have decided that whatever happens in the future, that level of cooperation and collaboration should never happen again. And so there is this underlying notion, not just that the Germans were benefiting from cheap natural gas in their manufacturing and industrial facilities, because they were. Right now, the German chemical industry, which is the leader in the world, optics, leader in the world, some of your more advanced medicines, leaders in the world. We haven't even gotten into steel and other areas of technology and engineering that the Germans lead in. All of those things are shutting down. Tens of thousands of Germans are out of work. So in addition to being unable to heat your home, you're no longer able to make a living, and the economy itself is being destroyed. Now, when this became clear to even someone as disappointing and unimaginative as Olaf Scholz, the accountant who became prime minister, he decided that it was time for secret talks with Moscow to find a way out of this, because he recognized that Germany was in serious, serious trouble economically and, most important, socially. Go back to what I was discussing earlier. You know, all the problems in a society that are suppressed and held in check by various forces suddenly come to the surface when the state turns out to be feckless and incapable. That's happening in Germany. So they're talking about social unrest on a scale no one has seen since 1929, 30, and 31. Unsurprisingly, we found out about these talks. And there is a theory, and I cannot prove it, and I have no facts to support it other than my knowledge of these talks and interests, that we decided to act, whether we did it or the United Kingdom's Royal Navy did it, or the Poles did it with assistance from the Royal Navy or from us. I have no idea. But suddenly we had this detonation and put this pipeline out of business, which essentially foreclosed German options and said, whether you like it or not, Germany, you are a vassal state of the greater American empire. You will do as you are told. You will stand fast and hold the line as we pursue this fight with Russia. Now, here's a piece of news I just received, and I don't know if this is right or not, but I received a tweet from Germany this morning indicating that someone in the German government, I don't know who it was, has said that the Nord Stream pipeline that was damaged can be repaired. And if that's true, I'm sure the Danes, the Germans, Dutch, and others will all be interested in repairing it. The other little piece of information that Americans are not aware of is that very suddenly, within 24 hours of the destruction of Nord Stream 2, you had in Poland a pipeline that had been built between Norway and Poland to carry natural gas suddenly begin to operate and provide, by the way, much more expensive natural gas than the Russians to the Poles. And at the same time, the Poles, out of the blue, decided that they want trillions of dollars of reparations from the Germans. And this is decades after these issues were settled by Germany in the 1960s and 70s with all of the states that were injured by the German military during World War II. So it's very odd to see this strange convergence of various activities right in the aftermath of this Nord Stream 2 destruction. In any case, it's a disaster for Germany. It's a disaster for Central Europe. And this disaster is having an impact elsewhere. Things are very bad in the United Kingdom. And the Norwegians have already told the British that if they're short energy this winter, that Norway may not be able to help them because Norway has its own needs, as well as its paying customers elsewhere. What we're finding is that all of the European states that have lived together in relative peace and harmony for 50, 60, 70 years, they're not so harmonious. And they are out for themselves. And no one gives a damn if something is what they desperately need and someone else has it. So that's why I say I think this entire superstructure of the EU and NATO is likely to first fragment, splinter, and then either fall apart officially or just sit a collection of empty buildings in Belgium. So
nuclear madness. It seems like NATO and the United States are on a path towards, to quote Joe Biden, Armageddon. Why would I say this? It seems that the United States and NATO believe that Russia, having suffered an embarrassing defeat in Ukraine, is on the verge of using tactical nuclear weapons to change their fortunes on the battlefield. This is the furthest thing from the truth. First of all, we need to understand that many of the weapons the West is accusing Russia of preparing to use, for instance, nuclear shells used in artillery pieces, no longer exist. They were done away with on instruction from President Gorbachev back in 1991, 1992, and their final destruction was overseen by the government of Vladimir Putin in 2000. These weapons don't exist, and yet somehow they exist in the minds of the collective West. The threat of a Russian nuclear attack also violates Russian doctrine. The Russians have made it clear that there's only two conditions under which they would use nuclear weapons. One, if they were attacked themselves by nuclear weapons, they would respond. Two, if there is a conventional attack that threatens the existence of the Russian state, then they would be compelled to use all means at their disposal, to include nuclear weapons, to save the state. Neither of those conditions exist. What's going on in Ukraine today is not an existential threat to Russia. The Ukrainian military, even with the extensive support of NATO, is not in a position of defeating Russia, threatening the Russian state. And yet, here we are talking about nuclear weapons. We have Ukrainian President Zelensky rambling about the need for the United States to conduct a preemptive nuclear strike. In short, if the United States is saying that Russia is getting ready to use the tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, then, according to Zelensky, the United States needs to preempt them by using tactical nuclear weapons against Russia. Let me remind you of what Russian nuclear doctrine is. Any use of nuclear weapons against Russia will automatically result in the total launch of Russia's nuclear arsenals, killing everybody.
We are, literally, on the eve of destruction. Now is the time for the kind of political maturity leaders rarely demonstrate. The onus is on Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin to make sure that even while events on the ground in Europe devolve into chaos and violence, the leaders of the world's two largest nuclear arsenals do not allow emotion to get the better of reason. The consequences of failure in this regard are terminal for humanity. Thanks for watching. If you like our videos, please hit the button below to like and share.